October 2011, Colonel Muammar al-Gaddafi is dragged from a drain pipe, beaten and killed by Libyan revolutionaries. The body of Libya's self-proclaimed brother leader laid out on a refrigerator floor, laying bare the end of his 42-year rule. But at the very moment a new dawn beckoned, Libya was to suffer the revenge of its own history. What's happening in Libya now? We have two governments, seems like a big mess.
The whole country is ruled by militias. The struggle between these militias, who will take more power?
We are now deeply embroiled in conflict, in divisions, in violence.
Everybody wants to have his share of authority and his share of the money.
There's no central government per se, which really has control. So it became really the front for a number of militias.
Libya is trying to shape itself again, but it's a country which is vast and it cannot be ruled centrally just from one city like Tripoli.
It's a process of disintegration of state of Libya. It became now what we can call the territory of Libya. It's no more state of Libya. The history of Libya is the history of the foreign powers who ruled Libya.
We have the Phoenicians come over to Libya, we have the Greeks come over and set up cities, we have the Romans, and then we have the Turks for almost 400 years.
It has been continuously a place of conflict between the civilization, between countries. So it was under occupation by every power that there is.
Libya, invaded, seized and occupied for millennia, was for much of its history no single unified land.
There was Cyrenaica, there was Tripolitania, Fezzan, and those also were not united for a long time.
Almost 1,000 years of Arab rule left a shared Islamic tradition across the three regions: Tripolitania in the west, Cyrenaica in the east, and Fezzan in the south. But they remain distinct, separated by geography, history, and identity. By the early 20th century, Italian colonizers would take over from Ottoman Turk occupiers and look to create a unified Libya, all of their own.
When the Italians invaded Libya, they actually viewed the country as the fourth coast of Italy. They came with the idea that Libya is part of Italy.
Beginning in 1911, Italian occupation was brutal and met by an organized resistance from Cyrenaica in the east. This resistance had its roots in the order of Mohammed bin Ali Sanusi, a Sufi scholar who'd established religious and political institutions across eastern and parts of southern Libya.
The Italian faced a civic society that was organized, that has its own institution, its own values. That movement produced charismatic, competent, non-corrupt leaders like Omar al-Mukhtar.
Omar al-Mukhtar, a leading Sanusi imam, led the fight against the Italian invaders. But in 1931, after 2 decades of a targeted guerrilla campaign, Omar al-Mukhtar was captured by the Italian army and hanged to death.
The event was more than a leader being executed. It made so many Libyans like if they became somehow submissive to the Italians, to the extent that they think if Omar al-Mukhtar can be killed in such a way, there's no way to fight the Italians.
The Italians would win the fight against Libyan resistance. but after their defeat in the Second World War in 1943, they'd lose Libya to British and French control. Italy's loss, however, was the Senussi orders again. In 1951, Libya became the first country granted independence by the United Nations, creating the Kingdom of Libya with the Emir of Cyrenaica, Idris al-Senussi, as king.
Libyan independence was created as a compromise. The Western leaders, the urban leaders of Tripolitania, agreed to accept King Emir Idris as the king of Libya in exchange for keeping the country unified.
He was from the eastern part. He was in exile in Egypt, and then he came back with the army, which with the help of the British.
King Idris, to a certain extent, was their man in Libya. So it was a country that really did not exist in terms of sovereignty. The United States, France, and the UK were actually running the affairs behind the scenes.
King Idris granted permission for Britain and the United States to build military bases in Libya. And when oil was discovered under the Libyan sands in 1959, British and American companies were first to be granted concessions. Libya would now experience the transformative power of oil.
Libya began to really change from one of the poorest countries in the world to one of the richest in Africa.
Before the oil, the extended families and the tribal leaders had their sons in the army because it was the guarantee for their future, because there was no business. After the oil, having a small store anywhere will give you a salary better than going to the army.
Oil money was shifting Libya's established order as the Arab world was enthralled to revolutionary times, embodied by one man above all, Egypt's leader, Gamal Abdel Nasser.
There was a huge wave of pan-Arabism and Nasserism, and military coups were taking place in Iraq, in Syria, in Sudan, and Nasser was inspiring young Arabs to go into the army and then plan and plot military coups to change regimes, to change what Nasser used to characterize as reactionary regimes, pro-Western regimes.
The army and the nationalists and the activist students began to agitate against the monarchy and the elite.
Agitation would turn to revolution. On September 1st, 1969, Idris al-Senussi was ousted while receiving medical treatment in Turkey. The group of military men who deposed the king were headed by a little-known 27-year-old officer called Muammar al-Gaddafi.
He was riding on an anti-Western, anti-imperialist wave. The first thing he did is he terminated the agreement for the military bases, both an American base in Tripoli and a British base in Tobruk.
It was a very popular movement because anti-colonialism, nationalism called for more egalitarian society or more modernization. But it's not a coincidence that only 2 of the 12 members of the council that led the coup in 1969 came from an eminent elitist background. Most of them came from a lower middle-class background. By taking these nationalist goals, the regime was very popular. Also, above all, you come very strongly on the side of the Palestinian call for justice in Palestine.
Arab nationalism, support for the Palestinian cause against Israel, and an anti-colonial mission to drive Western interests out of Libya. These were the pillars of the new regime, headed by Muammar al-Gaddafi, who, having promoted himself to the rank of colonel, looked to make even greater changes.
He took over the banks, the Italian banks, and Banca di Roma, Bank of Roma, became Libya's central bank. At the same time, he was very well engaged with his people locally. So he would visit villages, he would visit towns, he would meet people almost every day. At the same time, the rate of change inside the lives of people in terms of infrastructure, building roads, building schools, building hospitals, clinics, and so on and so forth, never stopped.
They had a very ambitious plan for nationalizing some big businesses and also taking over the oil industry.
In March 1970, the Gaddafi regime created the state-owned National Oil Corporation, the NOC, to take direct control of Libya's oil production and distribution. The NOC replaced the Idris-era Libyan Petroleum Corporation, moving the administration of oil from Benghazi in the east, where the vast majority of Libya's oil fields were located, to a new permanent location in the west, in Tripoli, the heart of Gaddafi's power. 3 years later, he nationalized 51% of all assets of foreign oil companies operating in Libya. Then in 1973, war broke out between Israel and Egypt, along with Syria. An embargo by the oil cartel OPEC against countries supporting the Israelis led to a quadrupling of the price of oil. For the remainder of the decade, Gaddafi would use this new money and new power to lay out his vision for a new Libya.
What was his ideology? What did he set out to achieve exactly for the Libyan people at the time, objectively speaking?
Yeah, of course, when Gaddafi came, he came with the same rhetoric that Abdul Nasser, which is حرية اشتراكية واحدة, which is liberty or freedom, socialism, and Arab unity. And also he wants to, the same thing that he got to liberate Palestine. So of course, this resonates with the Libyan people. And also at the same time, he introduced himself as a very simple person, that he will go and he will sit with the students in the university and he will drive his own car. So he is a person, he's from them, he's from among them. So he got a lot of support at that time.
What are your personal recollections of what he was like?
He was, as Dr. ABUSHAGUR said, very simple. And he came with no ideology. He found what the street wanted. And he had a lot of love. I remember he came to the university, we were discussing with him the law of the student union, and he came with the military fatigue. So one of the students told him, hey, you know that's in the university legislation, you're not supposed to come in with this kind of uniform. So he took his Volkswagen, went back to his place, changed, and came and spent the night with us till 3 o'clock in the morning, and we ate together macaroni that we made there. So I think this is the original Gaddafi. Is the simple guy that he does a lot of thinking, he has ambitions, but at the time he was not vicious.
I actually recall as a young boy 3 times when I met with Gaddafi or interacted with him. In early 1970, I was in high school in Tripoli. He came once to our school in his own yellow Volkswagen, alone. No security, no bodyguards. He drove all the way inside to our schoolyard, and we all came around and surrounded his car. He came out, we met with him, we started chatting with him. He was so modest and down to earth and wanted to be directly in touch with people. He was like that.
So it seems a very popular person at the beginning.
Within a few years, became very unpopular.
And that's the question. What changed him? How did he become that brutal, autocratic ruler in Libya?
Well, I think believe clearly, I mean, he, especially after death Abdel Nasser, he feels that he is the leader of the Arab world. And he's entitled to it. And he started with, of course, eliminating his group around him, the Majlis FETOURI, the council, Supreme Council of the Revolution. And of course, he wanted to introduce something new. First of all, he canceled the constitution. This has happened in 1973. And also he announced the Cultural Revolution. And of course, based on that, he put so many of the students, whoever in any direction, into prison. But he did something before that. He tried to bring all the intellectuals in Libya, whoever have an opinion there, and he made them speak to be able to categorize them, who they are, and which direction they are in. So 1973, he imprisoned everybody, the communists, the socialists, the Islamists, and all of them.
Including, by the way, including Mohammed.
Brother Mohammed, he was one of those
who
who
were
were
arrested in
imprisoned.
1973
Yes.
with everybody else, as a pan-Arabist at that time.
Well, they looked for an accusation.
A label, yes.
So what was the effect, the significance of the 5 political points he declared in Zuwara in 1973, at the time when you were arrested?
Well, he found a dissent growing up, dissent inside the RCC, dissent in the army, and he was not at the time with that grip on it. So he went to Zuwara, and he told us, we will all leave power now.
Yes.
We'll give it to the people.
Yeah.
Civilians.
To the civilians. So he went there, and he deceived them. So they're all out, but he's the leader of the new revolution, the popular revolution. And then, of course, to make it sound a revolution, he took us to jail.
So do you think he has always had that idea of becoming a dictator, or was this a reaction to a threat to his position in power that changed him?
I think...
Because as you said, there was growing dissent.
He didn't know more. Well, look, he didn't know more. He never had the education or experience to make him a Democrat. For us, I'm not in power, so I'm with democracy. I don't know if I'll be in power, although I practice democracy now where I live.
But there were coup attempts, assassination attempts. Is that what made him really brutal?
Let me complete the idea. So he had surplus of money that he never thought of. And here he saw politicians from everywhere. I saw the head of the Liberal Party in England came and tell him, Colonel Gaddafi, you are the one who teach us about freedom on Libyan TV, because he was treated well there.
So you think these sort of things changed him?
I think if we go back to the few years before the coup, Gaddafi was a very dominant figure with all his companions and colleagues, which he gathered around himself to actually do the coup. He was not going to accept criticism. He was not going to accept anybody, even from the closest of his colleagues, who actually did the coup with him, to force him to change his mind or policy and anything. And I think it was in his personality and in his character always to be autocratic and to be dominating, and he will not give in to other opinions. So the precipitations for a dictator were there in his character. And as things moved on and he started getting challenges, not just from his own group, Adam al-Hawaz and Musa Ahmed, a military coup attempt in December 1970, or 1969, sorry. And then the student movement were very expressive against him. I remember he used to come to Tripoli University, and the students were very vocal, very brave, telling him, look, you and your colleagues, the army officers, you should go back to your barracks. We want civilian rule. So as he had rejections from the students, from intellectuals, from army officers, he started to become very brutal to protect his dominance as his control over power.
He basically took a firm grip of the country, every aspect of the country's life. And I think that was the first clear sign that Gaddafi was heading to be an absolute dictator of Libya.
Despite growing isolation, Libya continues to pursue policies which are a unique mix of strict Muslim rules and Marxist ideology.
Gaddafi established the Jamahiriya, state of the masses, a system of people's committees under a general people's congress. This was part of Gaddafi's third universal theory that he laid out in his Green Book. He himself would claim to have no official role in the Jamahiriya, but would remain the commander-in-chief of the armed forces and go by a new title, Brother Leader.
I think it was to a certain point a successful experience to a certain limit. It was not completely independent system from Gaddafi. He's not the president of the Jamhuriya Republic, there's no republic, and he's not a minister, not a prime minister, and he's the leader of the revolution, which is kind of ongoing process that never ends.
It was diluted and subverted and became a way of really enhancing the mobilization and cramping and punishing dissident voices in Libyan society. The army was burst, the trade unions were burst, the student union was burst, the other independent association were burst, and everything became either you are a revolutionary or counter-revolutionary. And you could see that the informal institutions, the security apparatus, the secret police, the so-called revolutionary committees began to dominate the formal institutions of the state.
What Gaddafi is actually doing is working very hard to create a personalized, centralized state in which really there are no proper institutions and he is the center of everything.
Gaddafi was hollowing out Libya's political structures. All roads to real power would lead only to him, and all dissent brutally repressed.
The whole power became in his hand. And that's why he started really becoming very vicious against anyone who will even voice anything different from his opinion. The moment you think of that, you'll be in prison. If you're not in prison, you'll be hanged in the streets. That's where Libya have seen probably one of the most vicious hanging campaigns can ever happen. It was during the month of Ramadan. It used to be done just around Maghrib, and it is TV broadcasted. And they've hanged those young people in their own cities, so to show them. And also at the same time, they go and they destroy their homes.
While Muammar al-Gaddafi exercised brute force at home, his authority didn't extend to wider Arab affairs. Following the death of Egypt's Jamal Abdel Nasser in 1970, Gaddafi had seen himself as heir apparent to advance pan-Arabism. But Nasser's successor, Anwar Sadat, had sidelined Gaddafi during the war with Israel and ignored the Libyan leader as Egypt fell in line with Western interests, signing a peace treaty with Israel. Gaddafi took this as a personal insult and a betrayal of the Arab cause.
He's a leader with few friends in the area. The man who dreamed of uniting the Arab world is perhaps discovering that no one shares his vision anymore.
Muammar al-Gaddafi resented being sidelined in Arab affairs. Now, at the beginning of the 1980s, he'd look to the wider world for new purpose.
He became literally against everybody, especially in the Arab world, because he felt that all of them have betrayed the Arab cause, and he is the champion of the Arab cause.
Sudan. And anyhow, America has no right to interfere in the Arab matters. It is the responsibility of Arabs. America must be outside of this area. It is aggression. It is international terrorism.
So that's why he started supporting a lot of the movements in different parts of the world.
He was accused of supporting so many different terrorist organizations, from the Irish Republican Army, IRA in the UK, to the Red Brigades in Italy, or Mandela in South Africa at the time when it was only Gaddafi and people like him and Castro and Yasser Arafat who actually talked about Mandela positively and supported him.
Gaddafi might have seen himself as a champion of a global anti-imperial struggle, but for much of the West, he was a supporter of worldwide terror. And then in December 1985, simultaneous attacks on airports in Rome and Vienna claimed the lives of 19 civilians, including 5 Americans. The following year, a West Berlin nightclub was bombed, killing 3 people. 2 were American servicemen.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
European intelligence agencies suggested Palestinian groups based in Syria were most likely responsible for the attacks. For the US, however, the blame lay squarely.
Good evening. Please be seated.
With one man.
Gaddafi's long-standing involvement in terrorism is well documented, and there's irrefutable evidence of his role in these attacks.
Gaddafi, of course, was already hugely projected as a monster, as a terrorist. If you say he's a terrorist, everybody will agree. So it's easy to throw the mud at him, and it will stick.
And he didn't deny it. He didn't say that we are behind it, but he didn't deny that idea and began to say this is a war against colonialism and imperialism.
The leaders of the Western world have called you a terrorist, Colonel Gaddafi.
Your government is a terrorist government. Reagan is the biggest terrorist in the world.
This mad dog of the Middle East has a goal of a world revolution, Muslim fundamentalist revolution.
Reagan named him the mad dog of the Middle East. So Gaddafi answered him on the same day, naming him as the mad dog of the international Zionism movement. And of course, it was very, it was the lowest of the low of diplomacy.
In April 1986, diplomacy between the United States and Libya came to a violent end.
Today, we have done what we had to do. If necessary, we shall do it again.
The United States decided to punish him once and for all, actually by trying to kill him. They sent huge airplanes and bombed locations in Tripoli and his own house, his own headquarters, and own bureau office. But we also had lost some civilians, that including children, including babies. It's a clear and a blunt attempt by the United States, leader of the free world, to assassinate somebody because they don't like him.
Gaddafi was from the Arab world and was a suitable person to fight with because, after all, Gaddafi had alienated almost everyone. So he was a perfect foil for the Reagan administration.
Gaddafi's reputation as the arch-sponsor of terror was to once again make him the prime suspect when in 1988, an American airliner was brought down over the Scottish town of Lockerbie, killing all 259 people on board. The evidence for Libya's direct involvement in carrying out the Lockerbie bombing was less than conclusive. But in 1992, pushed by the United States, Britain and France, the United Nations placed severe economic and trade sanctions on Libya for its alleged involvement.
It led to so many disruption of life. It's so many kind of pinching sanctions, economic sanctions, political sanctions. Even the Libyan passport, when you travel, was a kind of accusation in itself.
Libyans completely were now enclosed inside their country, and they suffered for years because of his actions.
After the Lockerbie bombing, the sanctions came in, and that really hit Gaddafi hard, didn't it?
I think it hit the Libyan people hard. Gaddafi was not really affected by the embargo itself. It is the Libyan people who have been affected firsthand.
And with that, his grip on power really tightened as he was looking to be an international leader, supporting all these different groups around the world.
Well, by that time, the situation in Libya became marginal for him. He's now a part of a big international struggle. He's fighting against superpowers, and he's not also a puppet of the Russians. He's against communism, and communists in Libya are in prison. So now he's a part of international struggle. You know, the Libyans were marginal for him, and he got engaged in a battle that became, you know, like the snowball against the West. And the West was working against him. And that affected the Libyan population in a very negative way, because it was more dictatorship, more oppression, and everybody against me. He created an enemy. He created, when he started with, you know, supporting what he calls the liberation movements.
So would you say he was enjoying that role? Because he was accused of a lot of terrorist attacks in Vienna, in Rome, in Berlin, and he never used to deny any of it.
He felt that Libya was too small for him. He wanted a bigger stage So he tried with the Arab unity, uniting the whole Arab, as we say, from the Gulf to the ocean, from Bahrain to Morocco. And he failed with that. So now he wanted the whole world to be his stage. So he started supporting revolutionary movements all around the world. I recall somebody telling me, and this is exactly accurate information, that in the 80s, there was a camp in Libya supervised by something called the International Revolutionary Mataba. This camp had 17,000 trainees, military trainees from 35 nationalities.
Well, the question is,
including Irish.
Was he
from the Aborigines to the Latin America to Asia to all over the world.
Was he doing that because he believed in it as a revolutionary leader and so on, or as Mr. BUISIER said, he created an enemy? He needed that sort of enemy.
I think both. I think he suffered from grandiose illusions that actually he could rule the world. He could change regimes all over the world, and these regimes become, they emulate his own model, and he will be like the Mao Zedong of them, you know. That's one thing. The other thing, I think he enjoyed this idea that this man, the popular man of the masses all over the world, is taking on the imperialist. He's taken on the biggest imperialist in the world, which is the United States.
When the terrorist attack in Berlin happened, Ronald Reagan called Gaddafi the mad dog of the Middle East. So did the West need someone like Gaddafi to be, you know, an international villain as well? What was in it for the West?
I think they want to make an example of Gaddafi in the region, that if you go beyond your limits, then clearly we can come and attack you in your place. So I think Gaddafi, of course, that's, I think, personally, I think he is the one who created this for himself, because he thought that he has to become a real big player in the world stage. And of course, he does not have that power or what will allow him to do such a thing there.
No, I would like to add to this. Why did Libya came up in the agenda of the Americans 1979, 1980? I was part of the Libyan opposition, and I had a meeting with a foreign agency, American Foreign Agency. You know, it was imposed on me. And they said, we would like to help you. At the time, Reagan won the election. I can tell you now, at the time, the war between Iraq and Iran heightened. And Iran threatened to stop all the oil supplies from the Gulf. Yes. Libya, for the United States and for Europe, is an oil political entity. It's a supplier. When the supply from the Gulf is under heat, Libya becomes important for the United States. They wanted to topple him, put another regime that will bring Libya back to good relation and higher oil production and better relation. It's the same thing now.
It was convenient for the American foreign policy to find a maverick like Gaddafi and pick him as an enemy and put all this blame of international terrorism and all the mischiefs around the world on him. And I recall after the Lockerbie in 1988, and we all know now with hindsight that Lockerbie wasn't just the Libyan component, there was Iran involved, there was a group based in Syria involved. And if you have three bad boys, you pick a fight with the weakest one. And in this case, it was Gaddafi, because at that time, it was not convenient to pick a fight with Iran, and it was not convenient to pick a fight with Syria. So in that sense, Gaddafi played that role conveniently played that role for the West, and especially America.
Gaddafi eventually handed over the two Libyan officials suspected of carrying out the Lockerbie bombing. But the sanctions remained and fueled increasing dissent against the regime. One organization, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, formed by mujahideen returning from Afghanistan in the early 1990s, plotted to kill Libya's leader and replace the Jamahiriya with an Islamic state. It failed. Crushed by Gaddafi's security forces, many of his members, mostly hailing from Libya's eastern region, were locked up without trial in squalid conditions in Abu Salim prison in Tripoli. In June 1996, after being denied access to their families and to lawyers and mistreated by guards, the inmates protested. Some revolted, some escaped. In the chaos, an estimated 1,270 prisoners were allegedly shot dead by prison guards under orders from Gaddafi's intelligence chief. Though the facts of the incident remained contested, it became one of the most notorious episodes of the Gaddafi era.
That was one of the ugliest massacres, most brutal massacres under the regime. And I think in the long term, it haunted the regime.
1,270 prisoners killed. They have 1,270 families. Many of them were from Benghazi. The families of those killed in Abu Salim prison in 1996 started to voice their demands.
Those demands fell on deaf ears. The fallout from the alleged massacre at Abu Salim prison was part of a growing discontent simmering in Libya. But Gaddafi knew it was his troubles with the West, not least the UN sanctions, which threatened his authority at home. But then in 2003, the US invaded Iraq and changed the course of Libya's future.
The real change in course happened just after the death of Saddam Hussein's son in Mosul, Uday Qusay, who were killed by the American Special Forces. Gaddafi's wife at the time, she told him, you know, if it's you, you are free to do whatever you want. But I don't want this to happen to my kids.
The logic of the so-called war on terror led by the United States meant that a man labeled a terrorist could now be a friend of the West.
Libya has begun the process of rejoining the community of nations. And Colonel Gaddafi knows the way forward.
Gaddafi had been warning Western powers for years about these dangerous Islamist terrorists and the problems of Islamist terrorists, and complained that nobody ever listened to him. And suddenly the world woke up to the danger and the enormity of the problem, and suddenly would it be useful to have an ally in Tripoli?
Gaddafi would renounce his support for illicit groups worldwide, give up his nascent nuclear weapons program, and pay compensation to the families of those killed in attacks for which Libya would take responsibility. He would also introduce a limited program of reforms led by his son, Saif al-Islam, including the eventual release of some of the political prisoners held at Abu Salim prison. With that, all sanctions were to be lifted.
Please raise their hands.
Libya was now back in the international fold.
All of a sudden, what Reagan called the mad dog, this despot, this sponsor of terrorism all over the world, this supposedly developer of lethal weapons, became a good guy that governments like the British government and the American government could do business with.
Leading the way to do business in Tripoli was British Prime Minister Tony Blair. Blair's visit in 2004, accompanied by representatives of UK industry, culminated in the so-called deal in the desert that included an exploration agreement for Anglo-Dutch oil conglomerate Royal Dutch Shell worth more than $600 million. Libya's rehabilitation was revealing its truth, the West's top brass looking after its own bottom line.
In reaching out the hand of partnership today, we do not forget the past, but we do try, in the light of the genuine changes happening, to move beyond it.
One after another, Western leaders went to Libya, offering the hand of friendship, multi-million-dollar business deals, and the kind of legitimacy Muammar al-Gaddafi had long forgotten. From US Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice to newly elected French President Nicolas Sarkozy, Tripoli welcomed the West, and the West jumped in.
Gaddafi went almost 180 degrees in his relationship with America, purely out of the fear of what the United States could do to him.
He was very desperate for a long time to have a good relationship with the United States. And I think that what happened after he saw Saddam coming out from that hole in the ground, I think a message very clear came to him from the United States. This is what's going to happen to you unless you do this and this, because they want a political victory for them. And the condition there that you give up your nuclear program.
We started listening from Cheney people, and we used to know them, that let's start something called the constructive engagement with Libya. Yes. And they said one condition, that he gets rid of the weapon of mass destruction, not because he's going to use it, but because they might go to a terrorist group.
And then we saw Condoleezza Rice visiting Tripoli. We saw a lot of world leaders like Berlusconi, like Sarkozy.
Yes.
It started looking great for Gaddafi.
And I think Tony Blair and George W. Bush, and I remember this very well, it was very convenient for them because of their failure in Iraq, because of the big lie that Saddam had WMDs. What did Tony Blair come out to say? He said, look, although we did not find them in Iraq, but actually we found them in Libya. Yeah. And we managed to get rid of them in Libya without a war. So, so Tony Blair wanted to promote that as a success story, and it was very convenient for both. For Gaddafi to remain in power and to be rehabilitated, and for Tony Blair and George W. Bush to actually show some sort of a success against the background of their failure in Iraq.
We saw a stream of Western companies coming back to Libya, including British as well as American oil companies. Marathon came back, Conoco, Phillips came back, British Petroleum came back, Shell came back.
And then they take him to the next level of allowing him to visit Europe. And he was there in France, in Paris with Sarkozy, and signing agreements with the military companies, with the oil companies, and all of that. So now clearly Gaddafi willing to buy himself with the wealth of Libya to be accepted in the West.
But as Gaddafi was getting closer to the West, he was alienating himself from the Arab world.
للأسف يعني وضع العرب صعب جدا ومخيف يعني نحن أين نكون؟ مع من؟ نحن لسنا مع بعض الآن.
He has a clash with King Abdullah of Saudi, where he's trying to imply that Abdullah is just a puppet of the Americans.
There was also a bad chemistry between him and Prince Hamad of Qatar. There was a real bad chemistry. They never felt comfortable with him.
While Gaddafi burned bridges already charred across the region, he continued to build bridges, reaching out to sub-Saharan Africa. In 2009, Muammar al-Gaddafi was elected chairman of the African Union. He immediately vowed to pursue his vision of Pan-African unity, including a unified African army and a single African currency, all part of a United States of Africa. Later that same year, Gaddafi made his first ever visit to the United States of America and took the stage at his maiden United Nations General Assembly.
أما الآن المجلس الأمن عبارة عن قطاعية أمنية، قطاعية سياسية لأصحاب المقاعد الدائمة، يحميهم ويستخدموه ضدنا. وبالتالي لا يسمى مجلس أمن، مجلس رعب.
Far from having been rehabilitated, the man called the mad dog of the Middle East by a US president was showing his true colors and baring his teeth at those who believed they'd brought him to heel.
They were trying to rehabilitate him in the international community, but if you see his speech in front of the Arabic summit and also in the UN, it seemed like he didn't change when he called the Security Council the Council of Terror.
But of course, when he came to the United Nations, I think that's where he destroyed all the hope that those countries they had in him. They saw the real Gaddafi, that he's a person, he thinks that he is above the United Nations, he is above the world, and he is a person who can really dictate how this world will work. And I think that was the point where I say, clearly this guy, there's no hope in him. And of course, there is no hope. I mean, at least for the Libyan people, we knew that for 40 years, what this person has done. He has no interest but to be the dictator, to be the authoritarian regime that he has created.
Yeah.
Well, I remember when he came to New York. Before coming, they declined the visas for some of his delegation. And when he came there, they treated him bad. The White House treated him bad. Even for the dinners that President Obama called for, he was not invited. And he tried to challenge Obama by doing a dinner for African leaders. And of course, nobody showed up to his dinner. You know, so I asked one of his, still alive, I won't say his name, and he told me, well, it was fear. He told me Gaddafi talked out of fear.
It was almost impossible for Gaddafi to change. He's still branding America as imperialist and the biggest enemy of the world, and at the same time is working with the CIA, helping them in their anti-terrorist wars. I think Gaddafi was never going to change, because if he changed, that means he would finish.
He struck deals, financial and economic deals with the West, which is to the West's liking. But deep in his heart, he never actually trusted them, and he never believed in anything.
By 2011, the people that he'd ruled with an iron fist for 42 years were showing their distrust of their brother leader, standing up for what they did believe in and against the injustices of the Gaddafi regime.
We started to see small-scale protests and sort of eruptions of public discontent. So there was a slight sort of shift and an opening up. But really, by 2011, expectations for real change had been dashed, and people had realized that there was no real change coming.
Change was to come. A century on from colonization by Italy, Libya had become an important player on the world stage. Colonel Muammar al-Gaddafi had gone from being an accused sponsor of terror to an ally in the West's war against it. In the early days of 2011, transformations were sweeping through North Africa. The so-called Arab Spring uprisings had seen the end of two dictators, Ben Ali in Tunisia and Egypt's Hosni Mubarak. Pressure was building on Muammar al-Gaddafi. The battle for Libya was about to begin.
By 2011, we have to look at the international scene around Libya, especially the Arab Spring.
They were seen as revolutions, and they made the right atmosphere for something to happen in Libya.
Something would happen in Libya, and it would happen in the East.
The East has sort of a particular sense of itself and a particular narrative that it had been deliberately punished and deliberately marginalized by the Gaddafi regime.
Fathi Terbil, a lawyer representing the families of prisoners allegedly killed in Abu Salim prison in 1996, had been planning a so-called Day of Rage for the 17th of February 2011 in the eastern city of Benghazi. But Terbil was arrested 2 days before the planned protest. And as his supporters gathered to demand his release, they clashed with security forces. Protests demanding the release of Fathi Terbil quickly moved into protests against Gaddafi. In the following days, the anti-Gaddafi protesters, made up of ordinary civilians as well as growing numbers of militias, moved on to other cities, ransacking police stations and military installations. Protest turned to armed rebellion. Gaddafi at first held back from responding with force, but his restraint would be short-lived.
This is a militant uprising. Had Gaddafi used more force, he might have been able to suppress this uprising. It was his decision not to use heavy force at the beginning that allowed this rebellion to get going.
All bets were off. We saw Libyans forming their own armed groups, what were known at the time as revolutionary brigades. Essentially, the city just felt that they were making it up as they went along.
Gaddafi now moved to beat back the rebels and take back control.
The regime tried to snuff out the protests in a brutal fashion, in a way that sparked even more protests. So the funerals of those who had been killed by the regime triggered even more crowds to come out. People lost their fear.
The rebellion had spread from Benghazi as far west as Tripoli. Clashes between protesters and regime security forces peppered the capital city, along with demonstrations of support by Gaddafi loyalists. Libya was in the midst of a double-edged war for territorial supremacy on the ground and for legitimacy in the eyes of the wider world. Rebel militias played down their links to outlawed groups, including the Al-Qaeda-linked Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, whose members had been freed from prison 2 years earlier. Meanwhile, Colonel Gaddafi rallied his supporters against an armed insurrection by those he claimed to be drug-fueled foreign terrorists.
سنزحف أنا والملايين لتطهير ليبيا شبر شبر، بيت بيت، دار دار، زنقة زنقة، فرد فرد، حتى تطهر البلد من الدنس والإرجاس.
Gaddafi, when he's talking, clearly he wants to say that these are not the Libyan people that I know. These are just terrorists who they trained by Al-Qaeda. He wants to get the sympathy of the world that, come on, you're fighting Al-Qaeda in Iraq and other places. I am fighting them in Libya. Why don't you come support me instead of supporting them?
Territory which in the first 72 hours fell to the rebellion was grabbed back by Gaddafi. It was at that point that people began to warn of a bloodbath.
There started to be a push for a humanitarian intervention, and the push for this was coming from the rebels. They realized they were losing this war. And so the rebels said to themselves, well, what are we going to do? Well, the only hope is Western military intervention.
I don't think Gaddafi would necessarily have gone and massacred ordinary civilians in Benghazi. When he was poised to come back and take Benghazi, he'd retaken a number of other towns, including Ashdabia in the east, where he hadn't gone ahead and done a wholesale massacre.
The international community could not just stand by and see Gaddafi willing to kill thousands and thousands and thousands of demonstrators.
At the end of February 2011, a group of military officers and government ministers had defected from the regime and set up a National Transitional Council, the NTC, headed by the former Justice Minister, MUSTAFA Abdul-Jalil. Years of nurturing the military and hollowing out political structures had left little loyalty among elements of the Gaddafi regime. By early March, however, Gaddafi's forces had shored up their control of Tripoli and looked to head east to reclaim Benghazi. The NTC, working with the Arab League, an organization long at odds with Libya and its leader, urged the UN Security Council to stop Gaddafi from killing his own people en masse. But claims of impending genocide, of regime soldiers ordered to rape civilian women at will, were far from proven.
Don't tell me about the stories about Gaddafi killing his own people, the bombardment of Fashloum, the district in Tripoli, the use of rape, mass rape as a weapon, the use of Viagra tablets as a weapon. That's completely false.
Western NGOs went in and found out that none of this was true. But it was reported at the time, and it was reported by Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya, BBC, New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, all the TV networks in the West.
We've seen many dead bodies of Libyans shot in the streets.
Anti-government protesters have told Al Jazeera of what they call a massacre on Saturday in the town.
The body of evidence at the time seemed overwhelming because you had not just what the intelligence community was saying, you had what all of our allies were saying, you had what the regional partners were saying, you had what we were reading in the newspaper every day from press, from journalists on the ground.
truth was not the first casualty of the war in Libya, but it was now a fiercely contested asset. British Prime Minister David Cameron and French President Nicolas Sarkozy led the charge for direct action against the Gaddafi regime. They pushed for a UN Security Council resolution authorizing a no-fly zone over Libya to be overseen by NATO. But military intervention would be impossible without US backing.
You cannot do a NATO intervention without the support of the United States. And at the time, the Secretary of State was Hillary Clinton. Clearly, she's building a political career for herself, and she wants to take a position in the world stage.
Hillary Clinton was in Paris. And there, she met several ministers, Arab ministers. There was a video conference between Paris, New York, and Washington, D.C., and that basically Hillary, convinced, I guess, the president to take this decision.
She went to Barack Obama and told him, okay, now Gaddafi has tanks going towards Benghazi. If he kills the revolutionaries, their blood will be on your white shirt.
Unlike Barack Obama, the leaders of Britain and France had needed no convincing to call for a NATO intervention against Gaddafi. While David Cameron may have looked to bolster his fledgling credentials as an international statesman, for President Sarkozy, the drive to get rid of Gaddafi seemed both political and personal. The Gaddafi regime reportedly bankrolled Sarkozy's successful 2007 presidential campaign. That same year, Libya signed a multi-billion euro arms agreement that Gaddafi would later fail to honor. He also proposed the idea of a Pan-African currency no longer backed by the French treasury, another challenge to France's influence in Africa. On March 17, 2011, the UN Security Council, led by France, the UK, and the US, pushed through Resolution 1973, giving legal authority to enforce a no-fly zone over Gaddafi's Libya.
This resolution demands an immediate ceasefire and a complete end to violence and attacks against civilians.
They adopted a resolution that said that, amongst other things, there would be an arms embargo, there would be a no-fly zone, and all necessary measures could be used to protect civilians in Libya, except no occupying ground force.
It wasn't a no-fly zone, it was more appropriately called a no-drive zone, because it was able to hit targets on the ground.
NATO intervention was decisive in tipping the balance of power back in favor of the rebels. And also, of course, the training of rebel forces by foreign security and intelligence agencies enabled those rebels to move into the West and eventually to topple Gaddafi and to take control of Tripoli.
It led to not only de facto civil war, the militarization of the uprising, and the rise of the armed militias.
A lot of that was done through supply of weapons through Qatar in collaboration with intelligence services of the West, who were willing to turn the other way to the fact that there was a weapons embargo.
There's a lot of help from the Emirates, from Qatar, and who came to the help of the Libyan people, and that limited the suffering of the people, limited the number of casualties that took place in there.
Qatar, at the beginning, was very popular in supporting the uprising. But then the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia and Egypt supported the national coalition. Turkey became involved with support of Misrata. And so you find that the regional Arab countries and the European countries are involved in the Libyan civil war.
It was an opportunity for the world to get rid of a menace. It's called Gaddafi.
It's a coincidence in a rare moment of history whereby the aspiration of some of the Libyans met with the interests of Western powerful countries, and the country was literally tied up hands and legs, and thrown from the 9th floor for a bunch of terrorists and gangsters waiting outside.
Rebel forces made up of militias divided along regional, territorial, and ideological lines also contained criminal elements and those seeking their own gain. But despite their differences, the rebels were gaining the upper hand. In the east, posters of anti-imperialist national hero Omar al-Mukhtar took pride of place as flags of independent Libya, not seen since the time of King Idris, were waved by jubilant crowds. By the end of August 2011, rebel forces would take Tripoli, Libya's capital city and regime stronghold, without the fierce resistance many had anticipated. Less than 3 weeks later, the NTC was recognized by the UN as Libya's legitimate governing authority. With Tripoli lost, Gaddafi retreated to his hometown of Sirte, but it too was now close to falling. The rebellion was closing in, and for Gaddafi, time was running out.
In one of his recorded messages to his family, he said, "I will go down in history as a hero. I will never leave my country, and I never left my country. I never gave up."
October 20th, 2011, NATO aircraft attack a convoy of armed vehicles leaving Sirte. Rebel fighters on the ground receive intelligence that a person of interest may be among those fleeing. Moments later, Colonel Muammar al-Gaddafi is found hiding in a drain pipe.
Gaddafi fled, and then the rebels chased him down and tortured him and then murdered him.
For some, the final words of Libya's brother leader, moments before being killed, showed a broken man, frail and confused. For others, those words were of a desperate man clinging to delusion.
Until the last moment, he looks like he doesn't believe that what he was doing was wrong. And that's why I say, what did I do to you? I mean, come on, you destroyed their lives, you destroyed their future. Those people, they had no future whatsoever.
He symbolizes something to those who like him and those who dislike him or hate him. Those who picked up arms against him and those who picked up arms to defend him. And he still represents some kind of fear for them.
The world was happy, and I had a discussion at night with friends, and I told them, well, look, you know, the violence that happened with him might be the first chapter of a book that we're going to go through. If you live by the sword, you die by the sword.
Retribution was meted out to those who fought for Gaddafi. Some were killed. Some paraded through the streets. Others taken away, their fates unknown. A gruesome end for an often brutal leader and his supporters, but an end that may not have been inevitable.
There were a series of negotiations right at the beginning, right in that period when the UN Security Council authorized intervention and NATO countries started the bombing. And when the US State Department heard about this, they said, you need to stop those negotiations. And one of the US ex-military officers who was engaged in those negotiations, he said, and he's quoted in the newspaper saying this, if you're really serious about trying to protect civilians and end the violence, wouldn't you give 48 hours to see if they're serious about potentially agreeing to a ceasefire? Why would we pull the plug rather than give them a chance to see if they're interested in peace?
The very idea was to make as many people as possible believe that Gaddafi is evil. And once you believe he is an evil, you don't accept the idea of talking to evil. There's no way to talk to him. And that's what happened exactly. At least 4 major peaceful settlement negotiations. The Americans certainly got that.
We came, we saw, he died.
When Gaddafi sent his tanks to Benghazi, and still, there is no United Nations resolution. I asked a cousin of mine who was a dissident military man, a colonel, and he was in Benghazi. And I told him, well, Gaddafi is sending his tanks. What you gonna do? He said, no, don't worry. Because we had French officers in Benghazi, including generals. So do you think the French will let their people die? They took the Arab League all the way to New York. And the decision to bomb Libya was taken within a month. It took them more than a year in Bosnia, in Kosovo, in Rwanda.
So I think I think I need to respond here. Why did Gaddafi send a column of 60 kilometers of armed tanks and heavy equipment to Benghazi on the 19th of March? He was not going.
What do you think? If it happens in Manchester, they're not going to send.
No, sorry.
A column to Manchester to bring it back?
He was not going to celebrate with the Benghazi people.
Of course
he was not going to give.
Let's get Dr. ABUSHAGUR in.
No, I just finished this point. He was not going there to give out gifts or sweets. He was going there to take a city back or kill whoever stands in front of him.
The question is, I want to ask Dr. ABUSHAGUR, was this exaggerated by the media, including, Al Jazeera? And did Gaddafi really commit massacres?
No, I think I want to go back. The West did not do anything during the Tunisian Revolution. They did not do anything during the Egyptian Revolution. Clearly, they are fed up with Gaddafi. And here's an opportunity for the Gaddafi to be removed. And the Libyan people are coming out and realized that the 70 kilometers of tanks and military vehicles are going to attack Benghazi. They know that Gaddafi, and of course Libyans know that, Gaddafi is going to slaughter the Libyans because he doesn't care.
What was in it for the West? That's the question.
Well, I'll tell you what's in it. The price. What was in it is the price. Libya has a lot of resources. Gaddafi had a lot of cash, a lot of investments. Libya has 40 banks abroad that runs sub-banks of about 200 banks, including in New York, in Wall Street.
But at that stage, he had very good relationships with the West, and he made big deals like the deal in the desert with Tony Blair and BP and Shell. And
but he was...
That's why...
involved billions. He was
coming back.
That's why...
So why would they want to get rid of him?
No, he was reluctant, especially the French. He promised them a 10 billion euro.
Or more, yeah.
Or more, and he didn't do a thing. He didn't do a thing. Sarkozy was frustrated. The British were frustrated. Americans didn't care. But there was a kind of a lobby around the Clintons that made Mrs. Clinton, lead the way that the United States enter in this war. But it was not the interest of the United States government. It was the interest of some lobbies in the United States. They think that if the United States have some action there will be more interest for those lobbies.
We're talking about international intervention because even the UN resolution didn't talk about changing the regime, did it?
Of course,
it talked about protecting the civilians.
I was one of those throughout the revolution who come out on international media almost every day. What we were telling Western politicians and others and Arab politicians and the media that, look, Gaddafi is very brutal. He's not Ben Ali. He hasn't left. He's not Mubarak. He's not given up power. He's going to stick it out and kill as many people as possible to prevent his downside. We used to say, do you want another Rwanda massacre in North Africa? Is that what you want? Because will the international community conscious carry that? Remember what happened in Rwanda? The world turned a blind eye, 1 million people would be killed.
And the international community responded.
Yes.
But
they had to. It was their moral. It was their moral duty. Libya was a member of the United Nations.
I don't think moral had to do anything with it.
Arguments for and against the legitimacy of NATO intervention were being drowned out as the mission to protect civilians crept into regime change. Libya was now up for grabs.
It's the leadership of France and Qatar that took the Arab League to New York and convinced everybody to do. And everybody came in for the price. And that's what we see up till now. The Libyan people, whatever their pains were, whatever the oppression was used against them, they were a marginal factor in what happened in Libya. What happened and what still happens in Libya, and this is because the nature of Libya. This is not today, this is 17th century, this is 10th century, this is at the time of the Greeks when they came in, the Romans, the Turks. Libya is a low potential country.
What were the Arab interests in this, Arab countries? What was their interest?
The Egyptian was confused and they were not in a position they could do anything in Libya. Who led it was Qatar and then the Gulf countries, you know, and they wanted to get rid of Gaddafi. If Libya is developed on the Mediterranean shore, 250 kilometers from Europe, you know, both sides, well, the Gulf will be second-hand in the area.
You're saying they deliberately wanted instability?
They felt that the only country that has the same potential, but it's not in the Gulf Council, is Libya. It's out of control, you know.
I'm not ruling out a country's interest in Libya, but we need to put it into perspective. Gaddafi was already doing business with French, British, Italian, and American companies. Their rights were always preserved by Gaddafi, and you know this very well. So partly, I think, yes, economic interest is always there, but I think for an international alliance of 45 countries to support the UN resolution 1973 to go into Libya and protect civilians, and many, Norway took part. Norway sent airplanes and fighters and took part. So many countries took part in this alliance. That cannot be explained purely by economic interest.
But massacres are happening all over the world.
Yes.
And we don't see the NATO intervening to protect civilians in other countries.
And then let's not forget that what happened in those 8 months, 27,500 sorties with 60,000 bombs and missiles on Libya, the destruction of Libya and turning it from a state, sovereign state, into a territory that we see today, it is the action of the international community that has to come back and try to help us reinstate this state.
Immediately after the fall of the Gaddafi regime, Libya was under the stewardship of the National Transitional Council. But in reality, it was a torn patchwork of competing militias and awash with weapons. Under pressure from Western powers, the NTC hurried through parliamentary elections in July 2012, won by an outwardly liberal coalition, the National Forces Alliance. The second biggest party represented in the new parliament was the Justice and Construction Party, the political arm of the Muslim Brotherhood in Libya. The NTC was to give way to the GNC, the General National Congress, which would be based in Tripoli and given a mandate to govern for 18 months before the election of a new government. But as Libya moved to democratic rule, moves were being made that would give the militias even greater power.
Number one was the fateful decision by the transitional authorities to grant a state salary to anyone who had fought during the revolution. So what we saw happen was a mushrooming of armed groups. So the revolutionary brigades became even bigger and more powerful.
You find a young person who become part of these military formations, and he is making 50% more than a teacher who has been teaching for 35 years. The only job opportunity is to become a militia member.
Libya became consumed by political and economic turf battles. This is my money, this is my territory, this is my activity, not yours. And all those different groups whose contesting interests were suppressed under Gaddafi got a chance to say, it's my turn now.
The other crucial event was a decision by Mustafa Abdul-Jalil, then leader of the National Transitional Council, to concede to armed federalists, and federalists being those who were seeking some form of autonomy for Eastern Libya. They had begun blockading a key road in central Libya. He capitulated to their demands. And what was important about that was it was the first time in post-Gaddafi Libya where the lesson was learned that force or the threat of force will give you political leverage.
What happens is that the militias become much more powerful than the government. So really, they're under many ways under the mercy of these militias. There was no real institution built in Libya, so that means when Gaddafi goes, you'll find these institutions in place. For example, there was no army. Army is marginalized since 1986. And the only thing was there was the militias of Gaddafi and his children. These are to protect him. And these are the ones who they fought against the
security brigades.
Yes, yeah, to kill the Libyans in revolution.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Excuse me. The Israel on the 5th of June, well, I was an opponent to Gaddafi. I went to his jail. I was beaten on my legs, on my hands by his people. But let me be objective here. The Libyan army in 2011 resisted for 8 months, against 23,000 sorties. Israel in June 5th, 1967, used only 3,000 sorties. So come on. We're talking here.
When you say resisted, what kind of resistance?
No, they resisted. What's the point you're trying to make? Because we're talking about why everybody was...
Well, we didn't like the institutions of Gaddafi. We didn't like him being dictator. We resisted him. But we cannot say that Libya has no institutions. I would say, I didn't like the institutions, especially the political.
I can ask you one.
But there were.
Tell me about the health institutions in Libya.
Bad.
There was none. It is a revolution. Does not have a leadership. It does not have a plan for what to do afterwards. You have this vacuum that is in place. And then here what happens is that Gaddafi literally opened up all his weapon arsenals. And so now you spread out all the weapons in the hands of the people. You get out 17,000 criminals. They're out from jail and they are militarized.
This is the problem now. These militias, they got used to money and salaries and power and influence. And they grew and grew, they mushroomed. Their numbers at the beginning in 2011, they were about 20,000, 25,000 of them.
At the most.
Now, at most. Now we have about 250,000 because every young man who was unemployed, the best way and quickest way to get money is to go and join a militia. Militia life became very attractive.
Libya was driven by militias with conflicting interests. Violence as political currency was carried out with impunity. In September 2012, the US ambassador to Libya, Chris Stevens, was killed during an alleged attack by the Al-Qaeda-affiliated Ansar al-Sharia group on an American consular facility in Benghazi. Kidnappings and assassinations were now commonplace. In spring 2013, violence, real and implied, was used to force through new legislation that would favor some factions and weaken others.
There was very much a sense in Libya of victor's justice. And one of the manifestations of this attitude, this mindset, was the drafting and passage in 2013 of what is known in Libya as the political isolation law. And this was basically a hollowing out of expertise within key institutions of the state.
ويستهدف عزل بعض الأشخاص لأنهم تولوا وظائف عامة سواء أساءوا أو أحسنوا في إدارتها 30 سنة.
If you had any job under Gaddafi, you could hold no role in Libyan political or governmental life. Wiping out the technocrats, wiping out the non-political people, wiping out the competent people, as well as wiping out anybody who had any relationship to Gaddafi. It was a power grab.
In February 2014, without public consultation or parliamentary vote, the GNC extended its electoral mandate for 1 more year. It was a fateful move that led to an exiled military man to launch his own challenge for power. Khalifa Haftar, a former Libyan army officer, once part of the coup that ousted King Idris in 1969, had been abandoned in Chad after Gaddafi's failed war to seize territory in 1986. Haftar was rescued by the CIA and given US citizenship and returned to Libya at the start of the 2011 uprising. General Haftar now looked to steer a revolt against the GNC, but his appeal to overthrow the Tripoli government failed, so he regrouped in the east, vowing to restore order to a lawless Benghazi.
It was completely unsafe in Benghazi to go out. Every day, hundreds of people were killed, assassinated, day and night. Benghazi was a jungle. At the time, it was a complete jungle between different groups who are fighting for control.
Haftar decided he was going to try and put an end to all of this with his Operation Dignity campaign. He pulled with him groups of retired military personnel and then others who would come on board and join what he called his Libyan National Army, but which actually in reality was a loose collection of revolutionary groups and militias as well on the ground in the east.
He started the so-called Dignity war against Benghazi, against the terrorists in Benghazi. In Benghazi, there was, Ansar al-Sharia was labeled by the United Nations as a terrorist group. But there are also other groups whom they are part of the revolution. Clearly, nobody has labeled them as terrorists. But he put all of them together and he started attacking them.
He had a sort of explicitly anti-Islamist agenda, anti the Muslim Brotherhood.
ننظر إلى الإخوان المسلمين هم ناس يعني مش غير يشجعوا القتل بل هم أساس القتل.
His rise, or the start of this war in the east of Libya, triggered fears among some of those forces in the west of Libya that he might be strong enough to take Benghazi and eventually to move and take over Tripoli.
Powerful militias such as the Zintani brigades had common cause with Haftar and the Libyan National Army, the overthrow of the GNC in Tripoli. The Zintani brigades moved to seize Tripoli airport, a strategically important site, but were countered by a collective of militias targeted by Haftar's Operation Dignity. This collective called itself Libya Dawn and stood in support of the GNC. Operation Dignity labeled Libya Dawn as terrorists. Libya Dawn saw the leaders of Operation Dignity as anti-revolutionary Gaddafi loyalists. A new civil war was now being waged for control of Libya, running street battles shadowed by political infighting. The GNC had come to the end of its term, and following elections in June 2014, which were marred by widespread violence, it was obliged to hand over power to the newly elected House of Representatives to be based in Benghazi, shifting Libya's government from west to east, and shifting the balance of power from one bloc to another.
The government was to move to Benghazi once it had been elected, but it didn't move to Benghazi. Instead, a decision was taken to move to the eastern town of Tobruk, which in the view of Haftar's opponents was basically putting the parliament in even more deeply in Haftar's territory.
The elections were a real blow for many of the Islamist forces and parties, and the Islamists could see that actually things were about to slip out of their hands.
The old government refused to give up power, the old parliament. The new parliament, which was in the east in the wrong place, said, we're in charge now. And Libya began a period of two governments.
Countries like the Emiratis, the UAE, like Egypt, maybe even countries like Qatar and Turkey, countries like France, they are siding with one side against the other.
The General National Congress and the people who were part of that group in Tripoli, and some of them as Radans, were supported, at least politically, and perhaps more, by Qatar and Turkey. And this government in the east, under the House of Representatives, was supported, at least politically, and perhaps more, by Egypt and the Emirates. General Haftar went east, received his commission from the House of Representatives in the east, and you had two competing governments, neither of which had meaningful legitimacy, neither of which could deliver services, neither of which had national institutions operating nationally. The technocratic institutions on which Libya depended most, the National Oil Corporation and the Central Bank of Libya, continued to function as they always had.
There was a pressure from the international community that you don't play with the central bank, you don't play with the national oil company, you should keep them one.
The oil corporation continued to pump oil. Under the old contracts, the money went to the Central Bank of Libya. The Central Bank of Libya doled it out to the Thuar. You could have two groups fighting one another in the streets, both paid for, with salaries from the Central Bank and directed by neither government.
Oil flow boosted cash flow, but Libya was being blown apart. The UN, whose decision to intervene in 2011 inadvertently led to the arming of militias, looked to broker a deal in December 2015 to end the violence by creating a new Government of National Accord, the GNA. But the Tripoli-based GNA, headed by Prime Minister Fayez al-Sarraj, was rejected by the Haftar-backed House of Representatives in Tobruk. Haftar would instead seek even greater power by taking control of Libya's lifeline, oil.
It was clear that at some point he would try to control Eastern oil infrastructure, which he did. The moment that Haftar gained control of those Eastern oil ports, it changed in terms of the way international actors viewed him.
When General Haftar's military advisor and family members came to me in November 2016, shortly after the US elections, they told me Haftar intended to conquer the entire country of Libya, fire all of the politicians, end every element of Libyan political life, run the country by military decree. I said to myself, where have I heard that before? That sounds like Muammar Gaddafi.
I got a call from him.
From Haftar?
And he said, you know, can you talk to the Americans? And I did talk to the Americans. And I went back to Mrs. Jones, Deborah Jones. And
the ambassador. Yeah.
The ambassador. And I think the file was in her desk. And she told me, do you think a retired general with one MiG-21 and 30 trucks can change things? So I started communicating with General Haftar in good faith. The only dispute that we had from the beginning, that if it's war against terrorism, that's fine, but for the army to take over the country, we don't want to repeat the 50 years we had before. That's two different things, you know.
Khalifa Haftar initiated a full open war in Benghazi with militia groups like the 17th of February Brigade, like Rafallah's Hati Brigade, and others. These groups essentially were the revolutionaries who fought against Gaddafi in 2011. Later on, what they did, they went into an alliance with internationally classified terrorist groups like Ansar al-Sharia, Al-Qaeda, and later on in 2015, Daesh came into Benghazi as well to fight with them. So now what we had Khalifa Haftar on one side leading a fight against a group of revolutionaries in an alliance with terrorist groups.
For me, he's a militia because he doesn't have any legitimacy as an institution. He is a retired general, so he's like the other people who there and the other militias there. And of course, in this, he was supported by the Egyptians, by the Emiratis. They were supporting him with weapons, going against the embargo of the United Nations
I mean, that kind of support is very public now, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, it's very clear.
Support by Egypt and the UAE and Saudi Arabia.
Well, there is another point I would like to add.
Why is he supported from these countries?
Well, I want to add, you know, the General Haftar movement in Benghazi did not happen before General Sisi came to power in Egypt. The Egyptians wanted to guarantee their western borders, and they thought General Haftar can do the work that the Egyptian Western Front Command could do. So they were very generous with him, with ammunition, with guns. And then Saudi Arabia came hesitant, but the Emirates came with full power. And now I think the Emirates have even more say than the Egyptians in the East.
Our problem with Haftar is he still believes that the army should be in charge. And he belongs to that old mentality. The whole idea of the Libyan revolution of 2011 is to get rid of that idea that the whole country is totally absorbed in one cult personality. Now, Fortunately, and it's a great thing, that in the whole west of Libya, you will never now in Tripoli see a picture of any leader whatsoever.
Okay,
you will not see people talking about individuals. They talk about building a state.
So let's talk about Tripoli. Instead of one cult personality, now we have two governments. Can you talk to us about the government in Tripoli? The government of
National Accord.
Sarraj.
Yes.
Which militias supports this government, and who supports it internationally?
This government came as a result of the Libyan dialogue, which took about a year, and became from that the Libyan political agreement, which has been ratified by the Security Council and supported by the international community. So Sarraj government really, when it came and entered Tripoli, allowed the militias to take over. If there is a government, they are the one who are running it. But really I will not call it a government, to be honest with you. Because, again, they have no power except they can write decisions. There is a huge number
proclamations.
Proclamations, yes, they make them, but they
Statements,
have statements and the proclamations there.
That's all they do.
And that's all what they do.
The divisions in Libya are not based on ethnic or religious or sectarian factors. The divisions are purely political, purely based on disagreement on how to share power and wealth.
Libya's politicians were failing the Libyan people and failing to deliver basic services such as food, fuel, and security. Face-to-face talks between Prime Minister Sarraj and General Haftar in Abu Dhabi in May 2017, then again in Paris a year later, fell short of any roadmap to stability. Most telling, however, was not what was discussed, but where. As fighting continued in September 2018 between rival militias seeking a share of Libya's loot, Libya's fate, historically influenced by overseas powers, once again looks to be resting in foreign as well as Libyan hands.
France in particular seems to be leaning more heavily towards the Haftar camp and to be giving their backing to Haftar, mainly I think because they see in him a strong figure who can fight against terrorism, who seems to be more of a force for stability. The Italians, who are the other really big player in Libya, on the other hand, most of their interests in Libya are really in the west of Libya, partly because that's where a lot of the main migration flows going into Italy. That's the point of departure is Western Libya, but also because of Italy has a strong reliance on Libyan gas.
Libya is becoming a proxy, a kind of war without a military getting involved. The Emirates, Egypt, and to a certain extent Saudi Arabia on one side, and then Turkey, Sudan, and Qatar on the other side. And both of these sides have their own international controllers, if you like. If the United States really wants to solve the problem in Libya, they can do it very quickly.
Unless the outside countries will leave us alone for some time, and we Libyans come to our senses to be able to agree to save our country, maybe we'll not be able to. Maybe, unfortunately, we'll continue until we have no more weapons to fight each other.
Libya that we knew before is gone. It's gone. All what we see in front of us, the scene now, it's at the end, it's taking us to disintegration. Nothing is bringing the country back to unity, and every day we are closer to this final scene.